Hi there. My name's Jonathan Singer. I'm a professor of social work at Loyola University Chicago. And today I'm going to be talking with you about what parents and guardians should know about youth suicide. As we start, I want to provide a context. Um, and that is that if we want a world where people feel like their lives are worth living, we can't have a society that says that some lives are worth more than others. And I share this up front because even though it's essential that we are singularly focused on our kids when we're talking with them about thoughts of suicide, we can't forget that suicide is a social issue. It's a community concern, and that the effects of structural and societal inequities result in some kids feeling like their lives are worth less than others, and that can contribute to increases in suicide. And so I really want us to keep that in mind. And want to thank all the school districts that are doing everything every day that they can to address those structural and social inequities. Now, I'm going to provide some statistics, and I always like to quote my friend Jerry Reed, who said, "Behind every statistic is a tear." And that's certainly true when it comes to suicide deaths. Now, one of the ways that we can think about youth suicide is over time. So as you can see in this chart, starting in 2000, we have suicide rates about 7 per 100,000. And what that means is that for kids, for every 100,000 youth ages 10 to 24, there were about 7 that died by suicide. Now, between 2000 and 2007, the rates went down and then they went up, then they went down again, but then they started to climb pretty steadily up until 2017, when we can see suicide rates of about 10 per 100,000 kind of plateaued. And then starting in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, it increased. Now, why is this? Some people have said, well, it's because there was a relationship between the increase of social media and cell phone use starting in 2007 and the rise in suicide rates. And although there is some data to support that there might be a correlation, it's not a very strong relationship. Also in 2007, 2008, 2009, there was the Great Recession, which created enormous social upheaval. People lost their homes, kids had to move to new school districts, lots of economic and structural issues. What's true is that in general, we don't know why there are increases and decreases in suicide. And this is nowhere more evident than if we look at 2022, where there was a significant decrease in suicide deaths at a time where there was economic instability and a further increase in use of cell phones and social media. Now, another way to think about this is by looking at suicide deaths over a single year. And this chart looks at a calendar year. It looks at January through December for youth ages 10 to 19. And what this is if you look at that first number in January, you can see that there were 3,942 deaths in that 20-year time span between 1999 and 2019. Now, you don't need a PhD to be able to read this graph and to see that, in fact, there is an overlap between the academic school year and the increase and decrease in suicide deaths. So we can see the fewest number of suicide deaths during the holiday months and the highest number of suicide deaths in January, the month following the lowest number of suicide deaths, and then April and October, which roughly translates into midterms. Now, I want you to look at this dotted line, that's spring, because this is 1999 to 2019. In 2020, something really important happened, and it changed this long-term trend in suicide deaths. Now, the dotted line reflects this 20-year pattern, and the orange line is 2020. And what we can see is that the trend started the same. We have it was high in January, it decreased in February, but then it continued to go down. And in fact, it got low enough so that there were fewer suicide deaths in May than there were in June or July, the summer months. So, what was going on here? Well, one of the things that happened was that in the COVID-19 pandemic, all of the schools went fully remote. Teachers were scrambling, parents were scrambling, kids were scrambling. You would think that this upheaval might have increased suicide deaths, but there were some really important pieces to this that I think are important for us to think about. Number one, amongst high school students had about 45 minutes more sleep per night in the first couple of months of the pandemic than they did previously. Lots of reasons. They didn't have to take the bus, they didn't have to drive to school, they could sort of wake up, turn on their laptops, and there they were. And that had a whole other host of issues, but they got more sleep. There was more informal opportunity for parents and kids to hang out and talk with each other. There wasn't a fear of missing out, right? There was no FOMO because I didn't have to worry about what my best friend was doing on the weekend because they were also stuck at home with their parents. Now, there was a lot going on that wasn't good in the beginning of the pandemic, but these are some of the things that I think are really important for us to consider about how this might have affected suicide rates. Um, Two other points is that in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a significant drop in bullying and cyberbullying. Now, this might seem counterintuitive that there would be a drop in cyberbullying when everybody was online. But what we know is that bullying in person translates into cyberbullying online, right? So the same kids are engaged in it. Now, what's also true is that everybody was fighting the same invisible foe. And there was a sense that we were all in this together, which I think does contribute to the sense of I am part of something bigger than me. Now, if we look at the fall, you had some students go back full time, some in person or some hybrid, and then some remained online. And nationally, what this meant was that we saw an increase in suicide deaths again. Now, if we look at the 2020 trends, we can see again, here's 2020. And then in 2021, we saw a return to the 20-year trend of a decrease in January to February, then an increase in the spring, a decline in the summer, an increase at midterm, and then another decline in December. So some of these lessons learned, we need to work hard to implement them. But I think this is an important thing for us to know about the temporal nature of youth suicide deaths. So, what's something that you can use every day with your kids? Well, here's some warning signs for suicide. And a warning sign for suicide is kind of like a warning sign for a heart attack. It's something is imminent, something is about to happen, right? Different than risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So, some of the warning signs are if your kid is talking about or making plans for suicide, making statements like, I don't think anybody would care if I lived or I died, or I think everybody would be better off if I were dead. If they express hopelessness about the future, or if they display severe or overwhelming emotional pain or distress. Now, of course, I know adolescents can oftentimes express hopelessness or display severe, overwhelming emotional pain or distress. But if they're doing that in the context of talking about either wanting to die or believing that nobody would care if they lived or died, those are really important warning signs that something's going on. Now, if you combine that with some of these behavioral cues or marked change in behaviors, such as withdrawal from or change in social connections or situations, and that can include deactivating social media accounts. If there's recent increased agitation or irritability or anger or hostility that seems out of character of context, and that could include things like yelling at a grandparent they would never yell at, or getting in trouble with a school administrator, right? Threatening somebody, and you're like, that's not them. Or changes in sleep, right? Increased or decreased sleep. Again, any one of these things alone is not necessarily a warning sign for suicide. But if you put them all together, if you have a kid that's talking about nobody would care if they lived or they died, they're hopeless about the future, they've deactivated their social media account, they threatened the principal, and they haven't been sleeping much, those are warning signs that something imminent is going to happen. Now, as for the reasons why these happen, as I said in the beginning, there's lots of reasons why they happen. One of the things that if we just take it as a standalone, this idea of changes in sleep, if they're not making statements about wanting to die, but they seem to be up a lot, you want to make sure that you're addressing the technology in the bedroom, making sure that they are not using their technology when they are at bedtime, because that can have a real effect on how that changes their sleep and how that affects their sense of rest. Now, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not kids are becoming addicted to technology. And I really like this quote from Dana Boyd, where she says, most teenagers aren't addicted to technology. If anything, they're addicted to each other, right? At the end of the day, they're wanting to come back, they're wanting to connect with their peers. And so they do that online. It's a little different than when I was a kid and I had to pull the phone into the stairwell. And then at some point, my parents would pick up the other phone. They'd say, Jonathan, time to get off the phone. So, some of the benefits of the technology is that it provides for social surveillance. Kids check in on each other, kids know what each other's doing. If somebody's posting something online that suggests they might be suicidal, there are usually lots of kids around that can respond to this. Now, Dana Boyd also has this great quote where she says, on social media, interactions are often public by default or private through effort. And so our kids are growing up learning how to make private statements in public spaces. And I think one of the best examples that I've come across in the last couple of years is this image. It's got a picture of Kermit the Frog, it's got a picture of a sewer and a slide. And unless you know what it means, it's just gibberish. But if you put it together, it says, I want to Kermit sewer slide. I want to commit suicide. And so if you know that that's what this means, this is a way of conveying a private message in a public space. So how do we talk with kids about social media use in a way that can be helpful in terms of addressing youth suicide? Well, I think one of the things that we can start with is find out what are the apps and social media sites that kids are typically using. You can say, tell me how you're using this site. Are there ways that your friends let you know that they're upset when they're online? How do you let folks know that you're upset or struggling when you're online? What are the best parts about social media and what are the most challenging parts about social media? Right? There's all of this stuff about kids love being on their phones and things like that, but we know that they're ambivalent, right? A lot of them feel like they spend too much time on them, but they can't give it up. It is their town square. Are there times that your social media or cell phone is helpful related to your mental health? And are there times that your social media or being on your cell phone makes your mental health worse or makes you feel worse, right? And these are some questions that can provide a lot of good information for you about how your kid is using social media. Now, one of the myths about suicide is that people who are suicidal are weak. And in fact, people can be suicidal despite enormous strength and courage. And I found this online. I thought it was brilliant. It says, do not confuse my bad days as a sign of weakness. Those are actually the days that I'm fighting my hardest. I think this is a great reminder for us as parents. We oftentimes feel like we've failed somehow when our kids are struggling, or sometimes we think that our kids are somehow failures if they're struggling, especially if it's something that we have been working really hard to make sure that they can do or that they understand. Now, another myth is that if you ask somebody about suicide, you're going to put that idea in their head. And we know empirically that that's not true. Maddie Gould did a now famous study in 2005 where she found that kids who had recently been thinking of suicide, um, that their level of distress decreased after being asked about suicide risk. And kids that had not been recently suicidal were no more likely to say that they were recently suicidal after being asked, and their level of distress didn't go up. Now, this is the cover to the second edition of my book, Suicide in Schools. And I'm showing this because we had the graphic designer make one of the desks purple to match the cover color, but also to indicate this idea that you never know in a school which kid might be suicidal, which is really why it's so important for schools to do screening and why it's important for us to have these conversations with our kids. Now, some tips. Talking with your kids, parents, friends. So if you have a community of parent friends, ask them about how they think about suicide. What are their values? What are their attitudes? Do they talk with their kids about suicide risk? Is this something that has happened in their families? What is the community conversation? This is a really important thing. It can be particularly useful to do in advance, because if your kid or their kid starts talking about suicide, then you have a community of support. And if there's the need to um, get rid of firearms, for example, removing other lethal means, then you have a built in community that would be willing to do that for you. Another tip is to be available and make sure your kid knows it, right? So I'm around if you want to talk later. And sometimes that means talking to your teen while walking or gaming or driving. Those kinds of scenarios can be really useful in having difficult conversations, because you don't have to look at each other. It can be time limited. There's other distractions. Um, you also want to be able to validate your kids' experiences. And remember, validation is not the same as agreement. You can say things like, wow, it makes a lot of sense that you would feel that way. It doesn't mean that you agree that they should be feeling that way or that you agree with their interpretation. It means that you validate, you understand why they would be feeling that way. You want to ask open ended questions, right? Let your child steer the conversation to what they want to talk about. Avoid problem solving too quickly. Instead, you could ask them, what do you think would help? Having that collaborative conversation with teens can be really empowering, can be really powerful in reminding them that they, in fact, have access to the resources to be able to solve most of these issues, especially after you've validated their experiences, you've labeled their emotions. Now, one of the techniques that I use as a therapist that I find really useful when I'm talking with a kid that seems like they might be having thoughts of suicide, but they're embarrassed or ashamed, is that I take something that I know about them, about what might have been happening recently, and I say something like, I know sometimes when kids have been going through a really bad breakup, they have thoughts of killing themselves, even though that's not something that normally happens to them. Has that ever happened to you? Now, that could be a moment where kids like, yeah, actually, I don't really have these thoughts, but I did go through a bad breakup, and I was thinking about that. And I was really embarrassed, but now that you brought this up, I'm willing to share. And finally, communicate on their terms, right? There's nothing wrong with texting with your teen if that's how they're opening up to you. In fact, one of the first interventions that was demonstrated to reduce suicide deaths was called Caring Letters. And this was a project that Jerome Motto and colleagues did out in San Francisco, where folks that were discharged from the hospital after being admitted for a suicide attempt, half of them received a postcard like this, and half of them did not. And what they found was that those that received the caring letter, right? And again, this didn't say you need to call and make an appointment. We want to check up on your medication. It just said, hey, it's been some time since you've been at the hospital. We're interested in how you're coming along. If you have the inclination, feel free to drop us a note and let us know. What they found was that 2 years later, those who received the caring letters were half as likely to die by suicide as those that did not. And they ended up ending the project because the results were so profound. They started sending the letters to everyone. Now, of course, we don't necessarily send letters, but we can send caring texts. This is an example of a text I sent a client who was an adult, but I just texted, I'm thinking about you today. And they said, hey, thanks for checking in. I'm doing much better today, which is surprising because the rain usually bums me out. So I joked. I said, Win, I guess no Milli Vanilli in your apartment today. And then they wrote back, you didn't. Now that song's going to be stuck in my head. What kind of therapist are you? So it's the kind of engagement that reminds somebody that you care about them. And this might seem obvious, right? This might seem obvious to you that your kid knows that you care about them, but it can be really powerful to get one of these messages throughout the day. So here are some tips for parents, right? What can we do right now to decrease the risk of suicide in our children? Number one, make your teen sleep. Number two, talk with your teen. Number three, model mental health treatment. So if you are asking your kid to go to see a therapist and they see your struggles and your dramas and you're not addressing it, it's going to be much harder for them to say, oh, yeah, sure, I'm going to go do that. Because, well, why would they? Because you're not doing it. The next thing is want the best for your child, not for your child to be the best. Do they need to take 4 AP classes? Is that the best thing for your child? Is this environment the best thing for your child? Or is it that you want your child to be the best? And for schools, we have to remember that it's you and your teachers for your teen, not you and your teen against your teachers. If we're going to ask teachers to think about and observe our kids and then bring that information back to us, we have to thank them. We have to be grateful that they are looking out for our kids. And then get a pet, which most people did during the pandemic, and then keeping calm. As my friend Lisa D'Amour talks about, when you have a glitter jar, right, and you flip it all around and you see the glitter coming down, that's a good reminder for adults to breathe and to think, to pause before getting into a crisis mode with your kid. Because when you stay calm, it's easier for them to stay calm. Now, one of the things that I do for schools is I encourage them to conduct universal screening for all the reasons I talked about earlier. It's really important to collaborate with parents and communities, to have videos like this where parents can learn some information about what's going on with suicide risk and how the school is supporting their kids. I think schools should aspire to zero suicides. It's an aspirational goal, but I really think that every time a school staff member comes into the building, they should think to themselves, I'm going to do everything I possibly can today to ensure that I will do everything possible to keep this kid alive until the very last second. We want to train staff to recognize and respond to suicide risk, recognize mistakes as learning opportunities, and then make sure that we're caring for staff after a suicidal crisis. And then for youth, I think it's really important that we remind youth, when you're upset, don't worry about upsetting adults. It's our job to manage our own emotions. Kids oftentimes struggle. They get into the emotion center of their brain. They think about all the things that are going wrong, and reminding them that their reasons for living might not be in their life yet. I think it's important that they know not to confuse being sad, angry, scared, or lonely with wanting to die. I tell kids, if you are sad and lonely and you want to be happy and involved with other people, tell us that. We will do something about that. But if you say that you want to die, we're going to focus on keeping you safe and alive. And those aren't necessarily going to be the same things. Don't discount your experiences. Some are windows and some are mirrors, right? You can look through some experiences and see a different world. And sometimes they help you see who you are. And particularly for teenagers, this can be really powerful. And then last, it isn't all about you. The things that other people are doing, what's happening with your peers, what's happening with your parents, sometimes things are not about you. And then other times it really is all about you, right? So what you feel is valid, how you see the world is valid, and understanding those things are important. So I'm going to end with some information. 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can call that 24/7. Trans Lifeline is a great resource for trans and non-binary youth. Crisis Text Line, you can text at any time in 5 different languages. Trevor Projects, 24/7 texting and chatting and phone call for LGBTQ youth. And then there's something called Teen Line, which is actually staffed by and for teenagers. It's kind of amazing. I'm going to quickly flip through these resources about suicide. You're welcome to pause the video at any time and look at these. These are some of the resources I share both with parents and also professionals. And there's a lot of really great information out there on the web. So I want to thank you for your time, your attention, and I hope this was helpful in your effort to learn more and to think more about how we as parents can help our kids who might be struggling with thoughts of suicide.